We all know some basics in history. The War of Independence, the two world wars, and civil rights. But what about the stories that don't get much attention? Sometimes these turn out to be the most interesting. From deciphering a 3,000-year-old puzzle to a famine that wiped out 1/5 of a population, I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 important historical events you didn't know happened. 25. The Pisco War. Across Chile and Peru, people adore a local grape spirit known by the name Pisco, which both countries claim as their own. What most people don't know is that there are two completely different products, depending on which side of the border you're on. Ever since the bloody War of the Pacific between 1879 and 1884, where Chile defeated Peru and Bolivia, and over 25,000 lives were lost in the process, Peru and Chile have had this fierce rivalry. While the actual war was fought over the ownership of land high in nitrite, one of the lasting divisions is where Pisco originated. It's the national drink of both, so be careful what you say about it. 24. The Great Stink of London. Is there anything worse than a smell in your house you can't get rid of? Well, now imagine your house is an entire city, and the smell is so bad it almost leads to political chaos, a huge public debate, and one of the biggest urban planning innovations in history. That's what happened in 1858 during a period known as the Great Stink of London. A buildup of sewage in the River Thames combined with the heat wave that year produced an unbearable stench. It was so intense that British members of Parliament considered moving away from Westminster, which they had only recently moved back into after a devastating fire. Instead, they decided to make more permanent changes, funding a new sanitation system, including an 82-mile network of sewers to direct waste downstream and into the sea, a system that still works today. 23. The Viking Siege of Paris. Many of us know about the brutal ransacking and raids carried out by the Vikings on the English and Scottish coasts, but did you know that the people of Paris were once subjected to the same terror? In 885, thousands of Danish Vikings arrived up the Seine River, the same river that runs past the Eiffel Tower today, and began a campaign of looting, catapult attacks, and battering rams. After months of fighting the West Franks for control of the city, the Vikings eventually withdrew. All it took was King Charles the Bald to offer them 700 pounds of silver to leave. Apparently they didn't have a don't negotiate with terrorists policy back then. 22. The Great Vowel Shift. Have you ever wondered why English sounds the way it does? For example, to meet someone and the meat of a cow have different spellings. So why do they sound exactly the same? The reason can be traced back to a period known as the Great Vowel Shift, roughly between 1400 and 1700 in England. Over this period, vowels moved upwards to a different part of the mount. For example, the hus became what we now know as house, weef became wife, and beat became bite. Nobody knows exactly why the pronunciation changed, but it's definitely made English a much more difficult language to learn. 21. The 3 Mile Island accident. What place comes to mind when you think of a nuclear disaster? Probably Chernobyl or Fukushima, right? Well, the US had its very own meltdown in 1979. It happened at the 3 Mile Island nuclear station in Pennsylvania, when the cooling system malfunctioned, causing a reactor to overheat and a partial meltdown. A general emergency was declared in the area, but officials quickly downplayed the incident, saying there was only a small release of radiation, which thankfully was later backed up by testing. Nearby residents were exposed to less than half of the average amount that a chest x-ray gives. Still, the entire accident cost around $1 billion to fix, and understandably left the town a little paranoid. 20. The Zoot Suit Riots. In the United States, as World War II raged on, tensions bubbled up in a violent confrontation between off-duty armed forces and a group of Mexican Americans. The apparent spark for the violence was the type of clothing worn by the Black and Mexican Americans known as zoot suits. These were baggier than traditional suits at the time, designed to allow them to dance more easily. According to servicemen, though, these suits were made of fabrics being rationed by the government and therefore represented a lack of patriotism. When the zoot suits became associated with crime after gang violence, riots were triggered in Los Angeles, where many soldiers were stationed. During attacks on immigrants wearing zoot suits, more than 100 people were injured and 500 arrested. 19. Woman's Peace Party. It seems inevitable that the US would become involved after World War I broke out in 1914. However, not everyone was on board. Among the dissenters was the Women's Peace Party, an all-women's party campaigning against the war. Even more impressive was, at that time, women didn't even have the right to vote. When the US officially entered the war in 1917, the Women's Peace Party became divided. However, their contribution to the women's movement and to earning the right to vote a few years later was historic. 18. The decipherment of Linear B. Throughout the 19th century, archaeologists and historians were puzzled by a series of scripts found on the Greek island of Crete. Two of the languages, named Linear A and Linear B, both contain these kind of symbols, and both seem to be indecipherable. That was until 1950, when a man named Michael Ventris tried his luck, after becoming obsessed with the mysterious language. In his spare time, he worked tirelessly on Linear B, and in the space of 2 years had deciphered it as Mycenaean Greek, making it the oldest evidence of the Greek alphabet, dated to around 1400 BCE. Even more impressive, this was all just a hobby to him. Ventris was an architect. 17. The discovery of the Book of Kells. Imagine losing one of the greatest works in Christianity, a beautifully illustrated book dating back to the 9th century. That's what happened to the Book of Kells, thought to have been created on an island called Iona between Ireland and Scotland. When a Viking raid killed 68 monks on the island, it was probably taken to Kells in mainland Ireland, almost 60 miles north of Dublin. For 400 years, its location was unknown. Eventually, by the 12th century, it was being kept at an abbey in Kells. Now, medieval Europe's greatest treasure is kept under tightly monitored conditions at Trinity College in Dublin. 16. Operation Freshman. Operation Freshman promised to be the turning point in the fight against Nazi Germany during World War II. It was carried out at the Norsk Hydro plant in Telemark, Norway. At that point, Norway was under German occupation, and the Norsk Hydro plant had the potential to be its strongest resource. This was where heavy water was produced, a crucial ingredient in the making of nuclear weapons. Fearing that the Germans were on the cusp of achieving a weapon that could wipe out its enemies, Britain collaborated with Norwegian agents to fly out engineers and shut down the plant. Unfortunately, the operation was a massive failure, with terrible weather causing planes and gliders to crash, while the rest of the agents were captured by the Gestapo. In total, 41 lives were lost attempting to complete Operation Freshman, and they were all awarded full military honors after the war. 15. The Stockholm Bloodbath. Forget Stockholm Syndrome. 500 years ago, the city was infamous for a much darker reason, a horrible massacre known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. It came after the Danish king Christian II fought his way to Stockholm in 1520, took control of the city, and, as a mark of his new power, sentenced 80 noblemen to death. All of these were carried out in public in what was supposed to send a message to anyone rebelling against the Kalmar Union, which had united Denmark, Sweden, and Norway for more than 120 years. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Even groups previously aligned with the Kalmar Union were outraged by the scale of executions, and within the space of less than 3 years, Sweden won independence. 14. The Bernadotte Dynasty. Speaking of Sweden, did you know that for the last 200 years the country has been ruled by a single royal family known as the House of Bernadotte? They came to power when French military leader Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte was appointed King of Sweden in 1818, in part to win the approval of Napoleon. His descendants have continued to serve as monarchs to this day, with the latest being Carl Gustaf, who came to the throne when he was just 27 years old. Just a couple of years later, though, Sweden made a constitutional change, so the king no longer had any formal powers. Talk about being born at the wrong time. 13. The Danish West Indies. When we think of colonial powers in the Caribbean, usually Britain, France, Spain, or Holland come to mind. But less known is the history of Denmark in the area. During the time of the Danish West Indies, Denmark had control over the islands of St. Thomas, St. John's, and St. Croix, better known as the Virgin Islands. Like the other colonial powers, Denmark had used the islands as plantations, growing lucrative sugar plants worked on by slaves. However, in 1865, the same year that the American Civil War ended, Denmark opened talks with the US about selling the islands. It was the beginning of a long negotiation that dragged on for 50 years and was only finalized after World War I broke out. The final price? $25 million in gold coins, which is equal to over $600 million today. You've made it this far, so why not like, share, comment, and subscribe? It really helps the channel so we can keep making videos just like this. Also, don't forget to check out our socials. Links below. 12. The Carnation Revolution. In Portugal, the 25th of April is a sacred day. It marks the anniversary of the toppling of the Estado Novo. This was the system set in place by dictator Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, lasting between 1933 to 4 years after his death in 1974. That year, the armed forces and the public rose up against the government and demanded democracy. Known as the Carnation Revolution, it also led to Portugal withdrawing its forces from all its colonies across Africa and Southeast Asia. This year, the Portuguese took to the streets to celebrate the revolution's 50th anniversary. 11. The escape of Queen Gloria. If you've never truly understood the link between Portugal and Brazil, well, unfortunately, I'm about to make things even more complicated. When Maria de Gloria was born in Brazil in 1819, she had no idea the messy monarch she had just entered. She was in line to take on the Portuguese throne, but her father Pedro had ruled himself out as king by making himself emperor of an independent Brazil. When Pedro's time did come, he was still desperate to rule over Portugal instead of his brother, so he sent Maria to Portugal to become queen. That put Maria, who was just 7 at the time, in the middle of a royal family crisis, traveling through Europe to try and win support, and eventually on a daring escape back to Brazil. She only returned after a civil war to serve from the age of 15 until her death at the age of 34. Now that's what I call living fast. 10. The expulsion of the Jews. Ironically nicknamed Philip the Fair, King Philip IV of France is best remembered for a mass expulsion in the late 13th century. Just a few years after he came to power, the King of England had waged a war on the Jewish population, segregating them, forcing them to wear badges, raising their taxes, executing hundreds, and eventually expelling them all. Most headed south, over the English Channel, to find refuge in France. Unfortunately for them, France was no kinder, and 16 years later, Philip the Fair did the exact same thing as the English king had. He stripped the Jewish population of any money and property, carrying out the plan as a surprise attack, arresting 100,000 Jews in a single day. 9. The French Revolution's tennis court oath. A tennis court might seem like an unlikely place for a political meeting, but French representatives of the commoners, known as the Third Estate, were left with no other option when they were locked out of a meeting room by King Louis XVI. Inside a tennis court near the Palace of Versailles on June 20th, 1789, they all met together and took an oath to remain united until they could create a new constitution. This was the first major act of opposition to the king and set off the French Revolution. And within 2 months, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen was introduced, declaring liberty and equality for all without a monarch. 8. Nellie Bly circumnavigates the globe. In an age where newspapers were publishing more than just BuzzFeed articles and clickbait, one American journalist made a world-renowned achievement. Nellie Bly, who had built a reputation as a strong investigative reporter, was inspired by the 1872 fictional novel Around the World in 80 Days. And so, 17 years after that novel was published, she embarked on the same trip. At the time, there were no airplanes to travel on, meaning that Bly had to use steamships, trains, and even riding horseback. Incredibly, she beat the fictional tale's time, making it around the world in 72 days. Now that's good journalism. 7. The Batavian Revolution. If you ever wondered where the French got their reputation from, history provides some clues. Almost immediately after the French Revolution, France went to war with almost all of Europe, and one of their first major wins came after it invaded the Dutch Republic. For years, revolutionaries inside the Netherlands had shared the same goal of overthrowing the regime, and so took the opportunity to unite with the French forces. This marked the beginning of a new system, named the Batavian Republic. Some argued for years that the French were helping to free them from oppression, but when Napoleon's brother was appointed to the title of King of Holland in 1806, it was clear they were wrong. 6. The founding of the International Red Cross. The Red Cross is the most famous humanitarian organization in the world, aided by over 16 million volunteers. But have you ever wondered who created it? It all goes back to a Swiss man named Henri Dunant, who was always destined for philanthropy. He spent his teenage years volunteering, and after spending time in Algeria and Italy during wartime, he wrote in a self-published book about his experiences. Finding success, in 1863 he met with 2 doctors and an army general to establish a new organization, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which soon expanded to include almost all European countries. 5. The Norman conquest of southern Italy. Throughout the 10th century, Normans, coming from the southwestern part of France, slowly began moving their power to the south of Italy. By the mid-11th century, the town of Melfi had been established as the capital. Soon after, the leader Robert Guiscard arrived, who together with his family conquered the entire region of southern Italy through war and a series of political marriages. By 1084, Lombard, Calabria, and Sicily had all been brought under Norman control, a rule that lasted for 110 more years. 4. The Polish legions of Napoleon. Napoleon is probably the most famous military leader of all time, but did you know that he once enlisted troops of Polish soldiers into his army? Poland was in the middle of fighting for its own independence, and just like the Netherlands, many believed that allying with France was the way to achieve it. Polish units, comprised of exiled soldiers, were led by famous Polish army generals to help Napoleon's campaigns in Italy, Egypt, and Russia. Known as the Polish legions, up to 30,000 soldiers served in one of these units. Initially, Napoleon looked to be sticking to his promise when he created the Duchy of Warsaw in 1807, but just as quickly as he had arrived, he left Poland to fend for itself against the Prussians. 3. The Great Famine of Estonia. Can you imagine if 1/5 of the population of your country was wiped out in the space of 2 years? Back in 1695, that's exactly what happened in Estonia. The Great Famine was caused by exceptionally cold weather, followed by flooding, leading to a devastating shortage of food. Historians estimated that around 70,000 Estonians lost their lives, and because of the continuing cold conditions, many bodies were never able to be buried. 2. The Hallstatt culture. Which culture of people lived between 1200 and 450 BCE in the areas of Slovakia, Central Europe, Germany, and Northern Italy? Well, if you answered the Hallstatt culture, then you should really be entering trivia competitions. Fragments of their existence have allowed archaeologists and anthropologists to reconstruct what their ancient society must have been like. They depended on salt mines, with salt being used to keep food preserved, as trade, and as part of rituals. 1. Montenegro becomes a kingdom. Unless you're from the Balkans, the complicated history can be pretty confusing. Take Montenegro, for example, which declared itself a kingdom in 1910, just 4 years before World War I would be sparked by an assassination in the neighboring Bosnia-Herzegovina. Impressively, Montenegro had already defeated the Ottoman Empire in 1878 to declare its independence. This was enough to motivate Prince Nikola to create the Kingdom of Montenegro, and of course, appoint himself king. He later ran off to Italy during World War I, leaving Montenegro to fuse with the Kingdom of Serbia to form Yugoslavia. And that's a whole different part of history. And now, did you know that Winston Churchill was responsible for the death of around 3 million people? And no, it wasn't against the Axis powers during the war. Or how about the secret history of the Vatican helping the Nazis? Well, if you're a history buff like me, why stop now? Click here to watch 25 dark historical secrets that you never learned in the classroom. Mapping the most important events in history is a daunting task. With all that has happened over the course of 5,000 years of human history, how, you might be asking, can we dwindle it down to 25 things? Obviously, there were plenty of other events that occurred which had wide-ranging consequences. Out of all the kings, rulers, leaders, assassins, wars, and innovations changing the progress of mankind, what were some of the most consequential that reverberated throughout the world? That's what we're here to discover. So, ready to hop into a time machine and travel back in time? I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 most important events in history. #25. Greco-Persian Wars. It might not seem like it, but the Greco-Persian Wars were a huge turning point in human history. If the Greeks had fallen and lost against the Persian Empire, like everyone else in the known world, the Western world would likely not have the democratic politics, art, literature, and science it does today. The Greeks not only won against the Persians, but they thrived thereafter all the way up to Alexander the Great. 24. Alexander the Great. Speaking of Alexander the Great, when the Greek city-states were growing in their power, he rose up as a Macedonian ruler that would use his charm, cunning, and ruthlessness to conquer Persia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and some parts of India. Not only did he build a massive empire, but his influence on culture ushered in the Hellenistic period, a heavy mixture of Greek and Asian culture that would dominate the world for centuries. 23. Pax Romana. Pax Romana, which means Roman peace, was a period of peace and stability over the Roman Empire. It started at the reign of Caesar Augustus, when Rome had ruled Europe, North Africa, and Palestine, and lasted for 200 years afterward.
This stability allowed for further advances in art, culture, and technology, and established much of what would become modern-day Germany, France, and England.
22.
The life of Jesus. The life of Jesus was a major historical event which came about during the reign of Caesar Augustus in Pax Romana. Regardless if you believe Jesus' teachings, few deny how big an impact he left on human history and the massive religion that would soon follow. Christianity has impacted many elements throughout Western culture, shaping it for thousands of years to the modern day. With millions around the world worshiping Jesus as God, his influence has lasted far longer than most.
21.
The life of Muhammad. Born in 570 CE, Muhammad was born in Mecca, and at the age of 40 he claimed to receive a vision from the angel Gabriel. He continued to receive these revelations, which became the Quran. His teachings and message drew crowds, but also swift opposition. He took his followers out of Mecca to Medina, but eventually would gather so many followers he'd return to conquer Mecca. As we know today, his impact on Middle Eastern culture and the world grew with the religion of Islam, becoming the second most popular religion in the world.
20.
Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire. Let's hop over to Asia now and look at Genghis Khan, the ruler of one of the largest empires in human history. Few would actually point to Khan as someone who radically changed history, but his Mongol Empire had sweeping effects in their time and beyond. First, the Mongolian army was a terror, conquering, slaughtering, and pillaging wherever they went. But they were also good at being pragmatic and including and adopting all cultures to please the masses and maintain control. By almost uniting Eurasia, they were able to spread technologies like paper, gunpowder, the compass, and even trousers.
19.
The Black Death. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, earned its name by spreading across Europe and leaving thousands of dead bodies in its wake. By the end, 75 million people are estimated to have died. Afterward, with a human shortage in Europe, serfs could now have their pick of who to work for, resulting in better conditions for them and their families. People were much more bitter towards the Catholic Church, and anti-Semitism grew, with many claiming the Jews started it in the first place.
18.
The fall of Constantinople. Built by the Roman Emperor Constantine in 330 CE, Constantinople served as the Byzantine Empire's capital for centuries. Famous for its impervious walls, few thought it could actually be conquered. However, with the rise and spread of Islam, the capital eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. With the Ottoman Turks now having a foothold in Europe, the balance of power suddenly changed. Many Greeks converted to Islam or fled west. The conquest symbolized a victory for Islam, as they saw Constantinople as an affront for them.
17.
The Renaissance. During the time of the Middle Ages and the Black Death, education and knowledge were relatively stagnant. But starting in the 15th century, there was a rebirth of knowledge, art, and culture that started in Italy and spread across Europe. This Renaissance, or rebirth, brought with it new technologies and advancements, which created more prosperity and wealth.
16.
The Gutenberg printing press. One of the greatest inventions of the Renaissance was the Gutenberg printing press. Gutenberg took the idea of printing from Asia, but made it much easier and more efficient with his press. The first books he printed were Bibles, and they were all sold before he even finished them. The printing press fanned the flames of reading, education, and knowledge with the new capability of mass printing books that would have previously been copied by hand.
15.
Protestant Reformation. Something else that came out of the Renaissance, with the help of the printing press, was the Protestant Reformation. Starting with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which argued against the Pope's use of indulgences, the Reformation grew with others like John Calvin and Henry VIII questioning the Pope and the Catholic Church's authority. These grievances caused the Church to split into various denominations, such as the Lutheran Church and the Anglican Church. Both positives and negatives grew from this split, including bloody persecutions on the one hand and strength in universities, art, and education on the other.
14.
European colonialism. Roughly from the 1500s to 1960s, Europe expanded all across the globe. From the New World to Africa, India, and Asia, Europe created colonies on almost every continent on Earth. With colonialism came greater trade, which meant greater wealth for the Europeans and mostly slavery and impoverishment for everyone else. As time went on, many of the colonies sought independence, and after World War II, a devastated Europe began to lose control.
13.
American Revolution. The American Revolution of the 13 British colonies was a major shift in the status quo. Originally fought over taxation without representation, the revolution expanded into Enlightenment ideals and giving rights to all people. With the colonies beating back the English and winning the war, the Americans not only won a war for themselves, but for the entire world, inspiring many other countries to fight against the ruling classes.
12.
French Revolution. Inspired out of the American Revolution, the French Revolution changed France and Europe forever. What began as a protest against the French monarchy and the elite turned into a discourse of republicanism, human rights, and citizenship. Unfortunately, it became bloody and violent, and rather than leading to the latter ideals, became entrenched in nationalism and dictatorship. While the revolution was messy, out of it came Enlightenment-based philosophy, which also reverberated around the world.
11.
The American Civil War. Many believe the American Civil War was a mere family matter which only impacted the United States, but in reality, it had wide-ranging effects across the globe. For many in Europe, the American Civil War was evidence of republicanism crumbling. America was a shining example of the experiment, and if it couldn't withstand and stay united, what hope was left? Thankfully, the North succeeded and reunited with the South, surprising many, but also proving Republican institutions can remain intact after a hard and bloody war. Also, with America making slavery illegal, the slave trade virtually collapsed, with other countries in the Americas like Cuba and Brazil also abolishing it. It's quite possible that if the North had not won, legalized slavery would have continued on into the modern day.
10.
Industrial Revolution. From the 18th and 19th centuries, something amazing came out of Britain. Before, manufacturing mostly came out of people's homes or at shops, but suddenly all that shifted to major factories with machines helping mass produce all kinds of textiles. It's called the Industrial Revolution, and it changed Britain, Europe, and America from mostly agrarian societies to urban and industrial. Out of it came major innovations like trains and automobiles. Even though it provided serious challenges for the poorer classes, it improved the lives of the middle class.
9.
The Medical Revolution. Before the early parts of the 19th century, medicine was pretty much still in the Dark Ages. Some strides had been made, but it wasn't until the Medical Revolution that things began to change. It came out of the Industrial Revolution and the discovery that disease was caused by microorganisms. With the ability to mass-produce new medicines in pill form and create anesthetics, healthcare took on a new form and would lead to some of the greatest discoveries in human history, like vaccinations and antibiotics.
8.
Assassination of Archduke Ferdinand II. The Industrial Revolution changed a lot of things, but one major ramification was the growing sense of identity and nationalism. By 1914, with new technological innovations like tanks, machine guns, and deadly gases, Europe had become a powder keg of factions just waiting to go to war. So, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, toured Sarajevo to inspect the armed forces in Bosnia, something Serbian nationalists weren't happy about. Ferdinand and his wife were shot by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist. The Serbian government was blamed for the attack, which sparked World War I.
7.
October Revolution. While many of Europe's revolutions saw changes toward republicanism, Russia's October Revolution, aka the Bolshevik Revolution, saw their politics moving in a totally different direction, towards communism. Led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks against the Tsar and his ruling class, the October Revolution was complete in 1917. Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown and executed, ushering in the Soviet era.
6.
Great Depression. With World War I over, the 1920s brought about rapid economic growth in the United States, but it all came to a screeching halt with the crash in 1929. Millions of investors' dollars were lost, banks had collapsed, and 15 million Americans were unemployed. This created a ripple effect across the globe, with almost every country seeing large-scale unemployment and deflation. It lasted a decade and resulted in major changes in the financial institutions, economic policy, and theory. While the United States and other countries began to see signs of a recovery by 1939, World War II gave it a final push.
5.
World War II. While many thought World War I was over, deep roots of resentment and anger still existed in certain parts of Europe. With the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany, the war started with the invasion of Poland in 1939 and continued as they began to advance on France and Belgium. The war included all parts of the world, such as the Soviet Union, China, and Japan. By the end of the war, millions of lives had been lost. Europe was a devastated wasteland, and new superpowers such as the Soviet Union and the United States rose up to create a new order and new conflicts.
4.
Cold War. With the end of World War II came a new type of war, the Cold War. The Soviet Union advanced on Eastern Europe, trying to spread communism, while the West held on to democracy, creating the Iron Curtain. With the threat of nuclear weapons wiping out millions in a matter of seconds, the Cold War was born, and would continue for decades, using a war of undercover intelligence, words, and diplomacy. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and Russia.
3.
Sputnik. During the Cold War, new tensions rose with the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, the first satellite into space. It shocked the United States and sparked a space race between the two countries. The technological achievements created out of the space race included advanced weaponry, the ability for man to land on the moon, artificial limbs, water purifiers, and satellite TV.
2.
JFK assassination. President John F. Kennedy championed many efforts during his time as President of the United States, including softening tensions during the Cold War, advancing the space program, and fighting for civil rights. But with his assassination, much of his efforts were suddenly thrown into limbo. Luckily, his successor, President Lyndon Johnson, helped push forward his vision, and Johnson used JFK's legacy as a way to push Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act as well as fund NASA. Consequently, however, the biggest impact of the JFK assassination could arguably be the continuation of the Vietnam War. With his reluctance to put boots on the ground, many historians don't believe JFK would have heated up the war like LBJ. Without a Vietnam War, the world would have looked much different.
1.
Digital revolution. With the advancement of computers and the internet, the digital revolution has and continues to change the economic and information landscape. In many parts of the world, new businesses and jobs have grown out of the creation of the internet, but it's also provided challenges. With hackers stealing millions of dollars and identities, the mass spying from the NSA, and the use of false information to disrupt democracies, we certainly live in a brave new world. Enjoying our lists? Be sure to click that subscribe button in the top right corner and the notification bell so you don't miss out on new ones every Monday through Friday. Share them with friends and help us consistently conciliate curiosity. And if you want even more lists, check out these videos here or just head to our website at list25.com.
Historical photos you won't see anywhere else. Residents of West Berlin introduced their children to their grandparents living on the eastern side in 1961. Spirits of the Victorian Era, 1880. This is Pauline Musters, the shortest woman to have ever lived. The ship Queen Elizabeth arrives at the port of New York in 1945, carrying soldiers returning from World War II. This 1903 photograph was taken inside the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company in Tarentum, PA. It depicts an older method of glass production compared to modern techniques. Barbara Lagh performed in a production titled Quatre Roues in Paris in 1946. The iconic French landmark, the Eiffel Tower, was photographed during its construction on November 23, 1888. Construction took place from January 1887 to March 1889.